When peace talks were arranged to put an end to the years-long Syrian crisis, there were some questionable parties slated to sit at the negotiating table in Geneva. Now, before those talks were postponed in February as fighting escalated inside Syria, the Western media was buzzing, describing the Syrian opposition leading those talks as moderate. Yet there was little mention of who these groups really are, who's behind them, and their agenda beyond get rid of Assad. So here's what you need to know about these so-called moderates. The Syrian opposition leading the talks is known as the High Negotiations Committee, a carefully crafted nondescript banner. Now that coalition, though, is much more complex than its name indicates. It aims to unite the thousands of opposition fighters operating inside Syria. And if you've been following the crisis carefully, you'd know that most of the opposition is now made up of armed jihadists vying for power or who've been acting as proxies to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar since 2011 to overthrow the Syrian government. Many of these moderate rebels have literally ripped Syria apart through sectarianism and violence, and they've done it all with weaponry and financial support from competing proxy nations. Now, to top it all off, intelligence officials from NATO member states like the United States, Britain, France, and Turkey were on the ground training so-called moderates who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria months before the Syrian revolt even erupted to foment a coup against the Syrian government. Then they were legitimized by organizing them into the Free Syrian Army and getting international support and backing. And to top it all off, this H&C coalition to unite these foreign-supplied rebels is Saudi-backed and sponsored. No, it wasn't born in Syria, it was assembled in Riyadh by Saudi officials. The chief negotiator and the spokesperson for the High Negotiations Committee and the groups they come to represent should raise even more concern. Let's start with Salim Al-Muslet, who is the spokesperson for the H&C. He first started working as the deputy director of the Gulf Research Center in the United Arab Emirates from 1998 to 2011, the same year the Syrian revolt started. Now he's the vice president of the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces, which receives weapons and funding from a list of nations, including the US, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. That opposition group was not formed in Syria either. It was formed in Doha, Qatar, to provide its international donors with a legitimate, unified channel for all aid to the rebellion by acting as a moderate umbrella group to govern Syria after Assad is ousted. Now, the group's first president, though, Sunni cleric Mu'azz al-Khatib, described that as meaning that they are beholden to their foreign backers. Al-Khatib resigned in March 2013, lamenting that foreign powers were placing way too many conditions on aid to opposition and rebel groups and were trying to manipulate events for their own interests. Meanwhile, Mohammed Alloush, who is the chief negotiator, represents the rebel group Jaish al-Sham, an open ally of Al-Qaeda's arm in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front. Now, Jaish al-Islam is one of the most brutal Sunni Salafist groups operating inside Syria, and it receives its funding, arms, and other support from Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Jaish al-Islam, which is an arm of the Islamic Front, is known for mass executions, use of starvation as a war tool, as we saw in Madaya, kidnappings, pillaging, and alleged rapings. They've publicly stated that once they oust Assad, they will proceed to cleanse the nation of Muslim Shias, Alawites, Kurds, Zoroastrians, and Arab Christians as they establish a Salafist Islamic State. Now, it's no wonder the group has been compared to ISIS. With the talks postponed, it doesn't even matter whether they proceed, as long as negotiators are working with violent armed groups and rebels like those under the umbrella of the High Negotiations Committee. Besides being completely counterproductive, it's the same policy NATO members and the UN have adopted in Libya, Somalia, and Afghanistan, among others. And in each of those cases, those efforts have sunk these nations further into civil war and chaos. The High Negotiations Committee and the groups it represents clearly work in the interest of foreign nations, not in the interests or the will of the Syrian people. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say. Syria is in desperate need for peace talks. The ongoing crisis, which has led to the deaths of over 250,000 people and 11 million refugees, has left Syrians in the impossible position of having to choose between living in a war zone, being targeted by groups like ISIS and these competing rebel groups, as well as the Syrian government's brutal crackdown, or whether to fare dangerous waters to reach safety. But anything resembling peace talks simply cannot proceed with jihadists and representatives of foreign nations with a blatantly genocidal, apocalyptic vision for the future of the country. If our leaders truly care about ending terrorism, maybe they should start by not participating in it. And if our leaders truly care about democracy and freedom, then they'd allow the Syrian people choose their own fate without supplying weapons and meddling in their affairs. Maybe for once, they'd even put people over profits. Like most peace talks, the goal isn't ultimately peace. These talks represent little more than political theater to subdue the masses against the tragic situation that we, Western nations in the Arab Gulf states, allowed to unfold.